Hey everybody, here's a quick rundown of Chapter 19, The Politics of Industrial America. So 17, we were kind of covering some of the reasons why and how industrialization is occurring in the United States in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Then Chapter 18 kind of looks at some of the cultural issues going on with the rise in industrialization as people are moving to the cities. And different people groups as well. And then chapter 19 is looking at the politics of that. And it starts out showing the political involvement in party politics and how high that was. That people are pretty darn committed to their political parties. There's a lot of involvement. It shows some of those statistics. How many people are voting, which is much, much higher, as you'll see, than what we have today. Sometimes, like after the recession in 2008, we see this kind of rise in politics and in people's political involvement in presidential elections. This is showing presidential elections since the 1800s and how many people are voting. But it's much lower than it should be for all the men and women who have sacrificed their lives for this. It was just 36% in this recent midterm election in 2014. So things are kind of, since the census was done in 2010, things are decreasing more, which is a sign of concern. But very, very politically active people, lots of involvement there, but especially on a local level, as we'll see. There's a lot more activism, men and women who are involved in those popular politics. And this is one of the areas where women, since they're not allowed to vote on a federal level, that's not going to come until the early 1900s. Women are involved in activism efforts, especially the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance meaning the move to protest alcohol and the sales of alcohol and crusade against that, and how active this is for women, that they're concerned that the use of alcohol is inhibiting people's production, the production that men can have at work and on the home front. Certainly instances of abuse that occurred, as there still are today. And so women who are involved and then start crusading for other things, restricted work day, it mentions, and child labor. But this campaign of an awareness of drunkenness, which was a big problem during this industrial time where a lot of people become addicted to it. There's more of a desire, and some people feel a need to drink because their lives are so miserable. So women being involved goes on and shows that while women are involved, the United States is restricting the involvement of others, especially the Chinese Exclusion Act, and other groups that are. We saw some of this in Chapter 18, that concern between Catholics and Protestants, and the rise of Protestantism there with temperance and Protestants, that identity with them still being an important part of that activism that's occurring, but a bias against other people. Then it gets into some of the economics, this issue of greenbacks, and this is these dollars, the bills, they're supposed to represent an amount of money, so that if you turn in a $1,000 greenback, it's supposed to represent that much in gold. However, what's been happening in the 1800s, especially during the Civil War, is that all these greenbacks were printed, but there was no hard specie, that word for specie meaning like the gold and silver, that really backed it up. And so that means inflation and all kinds of problems, but groups like farmers are going to support greenbacks because that means more money is available to them. but other groups are going to be opposed to this because of the financial situation that it can lead to with inflation and the because there's not enough gold to back up what those dollars represent. So greenbacks are a huge issue. Our presidents during this time are really weak. This is not a time where, with all these political and cultural concerns, we have these strong presidents that we'll see in the 1900s, or that came in the early 1800s. These are guys people really haven't heard much of. Rutherford B. Hayes here, who it mentions from the winning a controversial election in 1876 because he didn't get as many votes as Samuel Tilden, who he defeated, but there's a compromise that's done there. Then James Garfield. Garfield doesn't talk a lot about Garfield. He is going to be assassinated by a man who is kind of crazy. Obviously, you got to be crazy if you shoot a president, named Charles Guiteau. Part of Guiteau's brains are still on display in a museum, but Guiteau, thinking he deserved a job working for the U.S. government in France because he had written a speech that helped Garfield win at one point, so a very disillusioned man. So Garfield assassinated in 1881, and then Chester Arthur became president, and talks about this situation at the top of page 576. The guy who killed Garfield, he thought he deserved that patronage. Patronage has been a huge issue with FIFA and the World Cup, that these countries that have voted for these corrupt FIFA leaders say, well, they're dishing money out to us, so we'll keep voting for them. Same kind of deal here, that phrase, to the victors belong the spoils. Arthur now and Congress are going to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which is really important because now jobs are going to be you can't just hand out jobs to your friends. There's a merit-based component to it, which makes sense to us in 2015, but that wasn't the case then. So making things more professional is now you have to take competitive examinations, as you still do. So then Arthur is going to have a short time in office, so still not a super powerful president before we get Grover Cleveland. Cleveland will actually, this is the only time that this happens in history, Cleveland loses to Benjamin Harrison, and then 4 years later Cleveland wins again. So he's the only person to serve 2 terms separated by someone. Cleveland had been criticized for having a child out of wedlock, and there was the expression his opponents used with a little baby saying, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And the response being, "He's in the White House, ha ha ha." So these weak presidents during this time, and that means that politics, with so many people voting, it's happening on the local level, and you've got these political bosses that it starts to mention, from the political machines, Tammany Hall being the most notorious of those. Gangs of New York, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio that's very inaccurate in some ways, represents Tammany Hall in New York City. So you've got these bosses who are very, very corrupt, and they earn a fortune, but they're working on the local level. And these precinct captains or ward captains, it talks about some of the things that they do, and it gives them, the people, things that they need. So there might be a group of immigrants. There's a picture, I don't know if I can even find it now. Let's see. Distracted. No, I can't find. There, you could have repeat voters There's crazy things going on there. We'll have to find a picture and post it on D2L later, where you could have these voters and you could get them to vote multiple times by shaving off their beard. This is kind of why you need voter identification cards or driver's license, or need to show something. They could shave off their beard, they could go vote again, and they would look like a different person, so they'd be given a new pair of shoes. They've got the political bosses and their employees giving them money and clothing after a fire, helping secure jobs for them. So of course those people on the lower level are going to be devoted to the political bosses, and those bosses will then be able to, by having power in local offices, get contracts and things like that and use those bribes to their advantage. Then it starts talking about, with so many problems in the cities, activism getting a little bit more extreme. Bellamy is one of the people it mentions, kind of this rise in socialism from his novel Looking Backward. Sort of a utopian thing to say, okay, here we are, here's how we live in happiness. That this idea of nationalism, or nationalizing work, that instead of private business and private ownership, where a few people are getting really, really rich and everyone else is struggling to survive, society owns the means of production. And it's a nice concept that people would then all kind of have this leisure together. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked well when countries have tried to put it into practice. But that's one thing that happens. And then another group that's very discontent as we start to get the birth of labor unions. We've got the Knights of Labor. When people saying, okay, we need to voice our concerns together. More power in numbers. Talks about some of the goals of the Knights of Labor: 8-hour work days, equal pay. They're not as open to everybody. Unskilled workers aren't permitted to join that. But then we've got people, as it's getting bigger, and there are more interests, it starts becoming more violent, and there are more people willing to express their ideas. That leads to tragedy at the Haymarket riot in Chicago, with all these different unions and union workers walking off on the job on May 1st, May Day, kind of considered an international day for laborers. And these anarchists, these people opposing what the government is doing, they are going to throw a bomb. And there was an awareness of it. They had actually put in the newspaper, working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force. So there's no question that this is going to be a dangerous event. It had been peaceful, and now it's not going to be on May 4th. 8 policemen are killed. Others are killed as well. So the United States becoming a violent place, with many people protesting against workers. Farmers are another voice of people who are discontent. So immigrants are unhappy and don't have a lot of power in numbers. Workers are starting to unite together, and as industrial workers are uniting together, farmers kind of start to do the same thing. This Grange movement that leads to the farmers' alliances, the need for more agriculture, the need for business practices, because so many of the farmers are struggling to survive as their prices are going down. They want more circulation of money by the Greenbacks. A lot of people working in industry are concerned about that. And the Farmers Alliance, a lot of those people are kind of going to, or this movement is sort of going to lead to the rise in the Populist Party, that will become a pretty influential group at the time. populist still. If you follow local politics, John Edwards, a senator who totally had an affair with his wife Elizabeth, who was dying from cancer at the time. Nevertheless, John Edwards, from North Carolina, born in South Carolina, was senator in North Carolina, ran for president and was the vice presidential nominee in 2004 with John Kerry. He depicted himself as a populist, one of these people still in 587 and 588, trying to win over the people who had been ignored largely by politics as it was happening in the Northeast. So people becoming more outspoken, a lot of different concerns as the country has become very diverse between workers and immigrants. And people are voicing those concerns, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but definitely leads to some sad times, some corrupt times as well. But more so some improvements and some things going backwards in some ways. But there wraps up chapter 19.